The crowd outside the church buzzed with venom. Phones raised high as trending hashtags screamed betrayal. Pastor Daniel said, "How could they believe such lies so fast?" His voice cracked under the weight of shattered trust. His wife Emily whispered, "They don't want truth, Daniel. They want blood." The sanctuary that once rang with hymns now echoed with silence, broken by murmurs of doubt. A reporter shouted questions, each one sharper than the last. Daniel said, "I gave my life to them, and they turn away overnight." Emily trembled, clutching his hand, her face pale with fear. Young James, his teenage son, stood frozen, eyes darting between glowing screens that displayed his father's downfall. Emily said, "Please, don't look." Yet the words trended louder, accusations multiplying like wildfire. Betrayal moved faster than prayer, and Daniel's name was no longer holy, but poison. Emily said, "This storm will bury us if we don't fight." Daniel stared at the flashing cameras, breath shallow, whispering, "But what if they never listen?" The church that once overflowed with believers now sat in eerie silence, pews empty, except for a few who stayed. Daniel said, "I feel their absence louder than their presence ever was." Emily replied, "Faith should not vanish with a rumor." The stained glass windows glowed with fading sunlight, casting fractured colors across the floor. James sat near the front, hunched, staring at the pulpit that once felt sacred. Daniel said, "That altar is not mine anymore. It belongs to Whispers." Emily gripped the hymn book, but her hands shook too violently to open it. James whispered, "Why don't they defend you?" Daniel lowered his eyes and whispered, "Because silence is safer than truth." News anchors spoke with smug certainty, their voices echoing in every living room. Daniel sat watching, shoulders hunched, while Emily whispered, "They talk as if they were there." On screen, headlines read, "Scandal in the Sanctuary." James stormed in, shouting, "They're lying. Why aren't you fighting back?" Daniel said, "Because the mob does not listen, only echoes itself." Emily's face turned pale, as another anchor said, "Evidence has surfaced." The words struck like stones hurled at a fragile window. Daniel muttered, "Truth is slower than lies." The phone buzzed non-stop, vibrations shaking the kitchen table. Emily slammed it down, whispering, "They won't stop." Daniel said, "Every ring feels like another nail in my coffin." James muttered, "It's never ending." Emily's eyes watered as she looked at Daniel, her husband unraveling under invisible weight. Daniel said, "I don't fear what they say. I fear who believes it." The kitchen clock ticked loud, drowning out his words. Silence grew heavier than the ringing. Daniel stepped onto the empty pulpit late at night, staring at the rows of vacant seats. His voice broke as he whispered, "Once they sang with me, now they sing against me." Emily said, "You don't need them, you need truth." James stood near the back, afraid to step forward, whispering, "What if truth isn't enough?" Daniel spread his hands as if to deliver a sermon, but only silence answered him. The echo of his breath filled the sanctuary, more haunting than any hymn. Morning light spilled weakly through the curtains as Daniel sat at the kitchen table, untouched coffee steaming beside him. Daniel said, "The world thinks it knows me, yet they never knew me at all." Emily stirred in silence, her face lined with exhaustion. James shuffled in, backpack slung over his shoulder, muttering, "Kids at school say you're a fraud." Daniel clenched his fist, whispering, "Your father is not what they say." Emily said, "Daniel, they are not looking for truth, they are hunting for blood." James dropped into a chair, eyes down, whispering, "Then why does it feel like they've already won?" The ticking clock felt louder than their voices, each second echoing judgment. Daniel looked out the window and murmured, "Once I preached hope, now I can barely breathe." Daniel stepped into his office, shelves lined with sermon notes, but his desk drowned in letters of hate. Daniel said, "They write as if they never heard me speak of love." Emily picked one up, her hands trembling, whispering, "They don't even sign their names." A knock on the door broke the silence. His old colleague Peter entered, eyes shifting nervously. Peter said, "Daniel, I can't be seen with you right now." Daniel's voice cracked as he replied, So friendship has conditions now. Peter avoided his gaze, muttering, "It's not personal, it's survival." Emily turned away, tears welling as Daniel whispered, "Then let survival be your gospel." The room seemed smaller as Peter walked out, the click of the door louder than any hymn. Daniel walked past the local cafe where whispers grew louder than greetings. Emily said, "They used to smile when they saw you." Daniel kept his eyes forward, muttering, "Now they sharpen knives with every glance." James trailed behind, shoulders hunched, overhearing two strangers whisper, "That's him, the liar." James' fists tightened as he shouted, "Stop it, he's not who you say." Daniel grabbed his son's arm, whispering, "Don't waste your breath." Emily's eyes burned as she pulled James close, saying, "Their cruelty feeds itself. Nothing you say can starve it." Daniel's face flushed with shame as he turned away, every step heavier than the last. The town that once felt like home now felt like an open court. At home, Emily scrolled through endless online posts, each one darker than the last. Emily said, "They are rewriting who you are in real time." Daniel leaned against the wall, whispering, "And the world believes their script more than my sermons." James shouted, then right back, "Fight them." Daniel shook his head, his voice trembling. "Fighting lies is like punching shadows." Emily placed the phone down with a thud, whispering, "But shadows still choke us." Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "The truth has no speed." James muttered, "Then maybe it has no power." The silence that followed weighed heavier than the words themselves, pressing down on all three. Late evening, Daniel sat alone in the sanctuary, his hand resting on the wooden pulpit. Daniel whispered, "This place was my refuge, now it feels like a tomb." Emily entered quietly, her steps echoing on the stone floor. Emily said, "Your voice once gave them light." Daniel replied, "And now my silence feeds their darkness." James peeked through the doorway, hesitant, whispering, "Dad, I miss the way you preached." Daniel smiled faintly, broken, and whispered, "I miss the man I was too." The flickering candlelight cast shadows of saints on the wall, their faces twisted in sorrow, as if mourning him too. The mailbox overflowed with venom disguised as words. Daniel pulled out letter after letter, each heavier than the last. Daniel said, "They used to send prayers, now they send curses." Emily stood nearby, whispering, "You don't need to read them." Daniel replied, "I must know what they believe of me." He unfolded a letter that read, "May your sins consume you." His hand shook, and James rushed forward, shouting, "Stop reading this garbage." Daniel whispered, "Every word is a stone they throw." Emily said, "Then let them throw stones, but do not build a prison with them." Daniel dropped the letters onto the floor, staring at the pile like it was an open grave. The church board convened without warmth, their eyes avoiding Daniel as he entered. Chairman Richards said, "We must distance ourselves from this scandal." Daniel replied, "I am this church, and you know my heart." A woman on the board muttered, "The congregation demands answers." Emily gripped Daniel's arm, whispering, "They should stand with you, not against you." Richard said, "Our survival depends on separation." Daniel clenched his teeth and whispered, "So betrayal is holy now." James sat outside the door, overhearing, fists tight, whispering, "They're abandoning him." The vote was cast quickly, and silence fell heavier than any prayer. Daniel walked through town square where posters of his face were defaced with red ink. Daniel whispered, "They've turned me into a villain." Emily walked beside him, muttering, "This cruelty has no bottom." James shouted at onlookers, "He is not what you think." Strangers sneered, one saying, "Fraud doesn't deserve mercy." Daniel placed a hand on James' shoulder, whispering, "Save your voice, son." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she said, "They've erased decades of love with one lie." Daniel stared at the posters, whispering, "It takes years to build trust, one rumor to destroy it." At dinner, silence was thicker than the food untouched on their plates. James said, "Why don't you fight them?" Daniel whispered, "Because their hunger isn't for truth, it's for blood." Emily slammed her fork down, saying, but silence makes you guilty in their eyes. Daniel stared at his plate, muttering, "Every word I speak will be twisted into a weapon." James shouted, "Then what do we do? Just watch them kill you?" Emily's voice cracked as she said, "We cannot keep breaking in silence." Daniel finally raised his eyes, whispering, "Perhaps silence is all I have left." Night deepened as Daniel stood in his study, staring at old photographs of baptisms and weddings he once blessed. Daniel whispered, "I was part of their beginnings, and now I am erased from their lives." Emily entered, softly saying, "They cannot erase who you are in this home." James followed, whispering, "I don't remember a time without your sermons." Daniel smiled faintly, broken, and said, "And now I fear you'll remember me as their villain." Emily placed her hand on his shoulder, whispering, "No matter what they write, we know the truth." Daniel's eyes glistened as he whispered, "But sometimes the truth drowns in silence." The whispers grew into fragments of truth when Daniel discovered a message left on his desk. Daniel whispered, "This handwriting, it belongs to someone close." Emily leaned in, reading the words aloud, trust broken within. James muttered, "Someone inside this house of faith betrayed you." Daniel's hands shook as he whispered, "I fed them, I prayed with them, I trusted them." Emily said, "Betrayal is always born from closeness, never distance." Daniel's mind raced through faces of friends, allies, and leaders who once clapped at his sermons. James shouted, "It's not strangers, it's someone who smiled at you every day." Daniel slumped into his chair, whispering, "The cruelest wounds come from familiar hands." The following day, Daniel confronted Peter in the churchyard, suspicion clouding his eyes. Daniel said, "You knew things only a brother could know, yet the world repeats them like curses." Peter avoided his gaze, muttering, "I said nothing." Emily stepped forward, whispering, "Then why do the rumors sound like your words?" Peter snapped, "I needed to protect my place when the storm came." Daniel said, "So you traded loyalty for survival." James shouted, "You destroyed him." Peter's voice wavered as he whispered, "Better you fall than me." Daniel's heart shattered as he whispered, "I called you brother." Daniel sat in the pews alone later that evening, his thoughts spiraling. Daniel whispered, "Peter's betrayal explains their hunger. He fed the fire." Emily sat beside him, whispering, "We cannot undo his lies, but we can uncover his motives." James said, "He envied your place." Daniel clenched his jaw, whispering, "So ambition weighs heavier than faith." Emily's eyes burned as she muttered, "He wanted what you had, so he tore it down." James whispered, "I thought loyalty meant forever." Daniel lowered his head, whispering, "Forever ends when envy begins." The candles flickered, casting shadows like daggers across the pews. Emily confronted Peter privately at his home, her voice sharper than she intended. Emily said, "You ruined a man who trusted you." Peter muttered, "I only gave them what they wanted." Emily shouted, "You gave them poison." Peter snapped back, and they drank it willingly. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "For your gain, you sold his soul." Peter looked away, muttering, "Better his soul than mine." Emily whispered, "You'll carry this betrayal longer than he carries shame." Silence swallowed them both, and the weight of truth settled like chains around Peter's shoulders. Daniel gathered Emily and James in the sanctuary late at night, his face pale but his voice steady. Daniel said, "We know now who set this fire, but the embers still burn." Emily whispered, "The truth must come out." James said, "Then let's tell everyone." Daniel shook his head, whispering, "They will not hear truth from me. Their ears are closed." Emily's voice cracked, "Then from whom?" Daniel whispered, "From those who saw, from those who cannot bear silence." James whispered, "There must be someone who still holds the truth." Daniel stared at the cross, whispering, "God knows. But will man listen?" The sanctuary filled again, not with worshippers but with restless voices and flashing phones. Daniel stepped onto the pulpit, his heart pounding like war drums. Daniel said, "You came for a spectacle, not salvation." Emily whispered, "You don't have to do this." James shouted from the front row. "They need to hear you, Dad." The crowd murmured, some sneering, others silently waiting. Daniel raised his voice. "You swallowed a lie, and in doing so, you killed truth." A man shouted back, "You killed it yourself." Daniel's voice shook. "I stand accused by the mob, not by God." Emily's eyes brimmed with tears as she whispered, "Hold steady." James clenched his fists, whispering, "Show them who you are." The congregation erupted with shouts as Daniel tried to steady his breath. Daniel said, "Peter betrayed me, not God, not truth." Gasps rippled across the crowd. Emily whispered, "They need proof." James shouted, "We heard him confess." Peter stepped forward from the back, his face pale yet defiant. Peter said, "Do not believe this fallen man. He lies to save himself." Daniel's voice broke. "I called you brother, and you sold me for your pride." The crowd murmured louder, torn between outrage and doubt. Emily whispered, "This is the breaking point." Daniel stared at Peter, whispering, "Your ambition turned my altar into ashes." Peter advanced toward the pulpit, his voice rising. Peter said, "You made yourself untouchable, Daniel. I only gave them the truth they crave." Daniel's eyes blazed as he shouted, "You twisted trust into a weapon." Emily rushed to Daniel's side, whispering, "Don't let rage consume you." James shouted, "Everyone heard him. He admits it." The crowd split in furious arguments, voices colliding like thunder. Daniel's voice cracked. "My name was never yours to destroy." Peter sneered, "It was mine to claim." Silence fell like a blade as Daniel whispered, "Then you will answer to the God you betrayed." The shouting turned chaotic, phones recording every second. Daniel slammed his fist on the pulpit, shouting, "Enough!" His voice echoed like thunder, silencing the sanctuary. Daniel said, "I will not beg for your belief, only your eyes to see betrayal for what it is." Emily's tears spilled as she whispered, "You're bleeding your soul before them." James cried out, "This is the truth, listen to him." Peter shouted back, "He hides behind God to cover his sins." Daniel's voice cracked, "No, I stand with God to expose your envy." The crowd trembled between outrage and revelation, the air thick with judgment. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper, his strength almost gone. Daniel said, "If you believe I am guilty, let it be. But know this, lies have a father, and his name is envy." Emily whispered, "You've given them the truth, whether they hear it or not." James shouted, "They can't ignore this forever." The sanctuary fell into uneasy silence, phones still recording, but hearts uncertain. Daniel whispered, "You came to bury me, but you buried your own faith instead." The words lingered like smoke in the air. Emily gripped his hand tightly, whispering, "You are not alone." James whispered, "Not ever." The sanctuary was empty again, only the echo of footsteps lingering. Daniel sat at the pulpit, his voice faint. Daniel whispered, "Crowds came for fire, not for faith." Emily stood nearby, whispering, "You gave them truth even if they rejected it." James said, "You stood tall, Dad, even when they tried to bury you." Daniel looked at his son with hollow eyes, whispering, "Strength feels like ashes now." Emily's hand rested on his shoulder, whispering, "Ashes still hold seeds of life." Daniel said, "If they see me as fallen, then let them, for I cannot control their sight." James whispered, "But I still see you." The silence wrapped them like a fragile cloak. Later at home, Daniel packed away sermon notes into a wooden box. Daniel said these words once built bridges, now they feel like ruins. Emily whispered, "Don't bury your voice forever." James shouted, "You can't give up." Daniel shook his head, whispering, "I am not giving up, I am stepping back." Emily's eyes filled with tears, whispering, "Without your words, the silence will be deafening." Daniel placed the last paper inside, whispering, "Sometimes silence is the only sermon left." James muttered, "They don't deserve your silence." Daniel said, "It is not for them. It is for me." News spread that Daniel had stepped down, and reactions poured like venom mixed with relief. Daniel said, "They rejoice at my silence, but they rejoice too soon." Emily whispered, "You chose dignity, not defeat." James said, "But it feels like they've won." Daniel looked out the window at the fading sunset, whispering, "Winning is not theirs to claim when truth remains buried in their hearts." Emily said, "Then one day, it may rise." Daniel smiled faintly, broken yet steady, whispering, "Or it may stay buried, but at least I walk away unchained." James muttered, "You deserve chains for none of this." Daniel visited the graveyard where elders of the church rested. Daniel whispered, "You led with truth, and now I wonder if I failed where you stood." Emily walked beside him, whispering, "You carried the same torch. Envy tried to snuff it out." James said, "But the flame still burns in us." Daniel placed his hand on an old gravestone, whispering, "If my legacy is silence, let it still whisper faith." Emily's tears fell quietly as she whispered, "Your silence speaks louder than their lies." James muttered, "And I will shout what you cannot." Daniel looked at his son with softened eyes, whispering, "Then truth is safe." That night, Daniel sat with Emily and James in the quiet of their home. Daniel whispered, "I may no longer be their pastor, but I remain your father, your husband, your truth." Emily held his hand tightly, whispering, "That is the only flock that matters now." James said, "They can cancel sermons, not souls." Daniel smiled faintly, whispering, "My voice may be silenced, but love remains unbroken." Emily whispered, "And love is stronger than lies." James muttered, "One day, they'll remember who you really were." Daniel whispered, "Whether they do or not, I am at peace tonight." Silence settled not as burden but as grace. Daniel walked through the empty sanctuary one last time, each step echoing louder than the last hymn ever sung. Daniel whispered, "These walls held my voice, now they hold my silence." Emily followed behind, whispering, "You leave not as a failure, but as a man stripped bare." James said, "This place doesn't deserve you anymore." Daniel placed his hand on the pulpit, whispering, "It was never mine, only borrowed." Emily whispered, "Your words still live in hearts, even if they deny it." Daniel's breath trembled, whispering, "Then let the silence be my final sermon." James muttered, "Your silence thunders louder than their noise." The church bell rang outside, slow and hollow, as Daniel stepped into the courtyard. Daniel whispered, "Once this sound called the faithful, now it tolls for me." Emily said, "It tolls for their blindness, not for your truth." James shouted, "They will remember this moment." Daniel looked up at the tower, whispering, "No bell can silence envy's echo." Emily's tears slipped down her face, whispering, "But envy cannot silence eternity." James muttered, "Your voice will rise again, even if not today." Daniel whispered, "Then let God keep my voice safe until they are ready to listen." Back at home, Daniel opened the wooden box of sermons, his hands trembling. Daniel whispered, "Every word I wrote was meant to heal." Emily whispered, "And they did, for years." James muttered, "They will again." Daniel pulled one page free, whispering, "They read lies instead of these truths." Emily said, "Because lies are faster than faith, but not stronger." Daniel whispered, "Let this page be my last gift to you." James leaned closer, whispering, "Then it is not lost." Daniel folded the page gently, whispering, "Truth is never lost, only buried." The next morning, Daniel walked alone through the town square where posters still defamed him. Daniel whispered, "They see a villain, not the man who once blessed their children." Emily and James joined him, Emily whispering, "Let them see shadows. We walk in light." James shouted, "He is not who you painted him to be." Onlookers whispered, phones lifted again, but Daniel stood still, whispering, "Your silence condemns louder than your words." Emily gripped his arm, whispering, "We do not need them." James muttered, "One day, they'll choke on their silence." Daniel whispered, "And I will already be gone." That evening, Daniel stood by the window as the sun sank, painting the sky in fire. Daniel whispered, "They burned my name, but they cannot burn my soul. Emily stood close, whispering, "You still belong to us." James whispered, "And to truth itself." Daniel smiled faintly, whispering, "Let history carry my silence, and let eternity judge the lie." Emily's tears shimmered, whispering, "You are not forgotten." James whispered, "Not now, not ever." Daniel closed his eyes, whispering, "Then let my final sermon be silence." The room fell still, the last word etched in the air like thunder wrapped in quiet.